The 50 most famous artworks by Sandro Botticelli. Number 50. Judith with the Head of Holofernes. Circa 1472. Inspired by the biblical narrative of the Book of Judith, this work by Sandro Botticelli captures a moment of triumph and determination in the figure of the heroine who has defeated the tyrant. The painting emerges in a Florentine context where art served as a tool to exalt moral and political virtues. In it, Botticelli not only evokes Judith's courage, but also establishes a parallel with the reality of Florence, in constant struggle for its autonomy. The composition balances the grace of the protagonist with the dramatic symbolic charge of the decapitated head of Holofernes, creating a contrast that defines the very essence of the early Renaissance. The delicacy of the strokes and the meticulous application of tempera on wood are evidence of the artist's technical mastery. The fluidity of the fabrics, with meticulously modeled folds, demonstrates his ability to confer lightness to forms, while the subtle gilding on Judith's attire hints at a luminosity that reinforces her divine character. In symbolic terms, the work exalts the victory of virtue over tyranny, a recurring message in Florentine iconography. Today, the piece is in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, where it is part of the collection of early works by Botticelli. Its influence extends to numerous later representations of Judith, in which the heroine is endowed with the same ethereal elegance that Botticelli gave her in this interpretation. Number 49. The Virgin and Child with St. John, Tondo. Circa 1490. In the last period of his career, Botticelli explored intimacy and devotion in greater depth in circular compositions known as tondos. This work is part of this interest in the domestic and the celestial, uniting the sacredness of the Virgin and Child with the tender figure of St. John. The work reflects a Florence deeply influenced by Neoplatonic thought, where the divine and the human are intertwined in harmony. The artist manages to endow the scene with an unmistakable lyricism, elevating the everyday to a spiritual plane through the delicacy of gestures and expressions. Botticelli uses tempera on wood with a subtlety that allows for the appearance of soft tones and delicate transitions in the faces of the figures. The circular arrangement reinforces the unity of the group, while the dynamism of the postures suggests a spiritual choreography. The symbolism of the work lies in the relationship between the characters. The little St. John, with his devout gaze, foreshadows the fate of the child, while the melancholic Virgin seems to anticipate his sacrifice. Today, this piece is kept in the Palatine Gallery of the Pitti Palace in Florence, forming part of the collection of Renaissance masterpieces. Its influence is visible in the later Florentine pictorial tradition, in which the tondo format was consolidated as a favorite resource for scenes of Marian devotion. Number 48. The Virgin and Child with an Angel. Circa 1465 and 1467. This oil painting, one of the first manifestations of Botticelli's genius, reveals his early inclination for linear delicacy and the spirituality contained in the expression of his figures. The scene, of a touching tenderness, follows the tradition of Marian representation, but with an innovative sensitivity that moves away from Gothic hieratism to approach a tangible humanity. Despite his relative youth, Botticelli demonstrates a refined mastery of composition and a chromatic sensitivity that anticipates his artistic maturity. The influence of Filippo Lippi, his teacher, is evident in the sweetness of the faces and the lightness of the veils that envelop the Virgin and the Angel. Technically, the work is executed using tempera on panel, allowing for precise definition of the contours and fluidity in the drapery. The ethereal atmosphere is accentuated by a subtle sfumato that envelops the figures in a soft, golden light. The angel, with an almost tangible presence, not only acts as a companion, but introduces an element of contemplation and heavenly grace. In symbolic terms, the work underlines the immaculate purity of the Virgin and the serenity of the child, creating an ideal of Renaissance beauty that would influence later generations. Today, this work is in the National Gallery in London, where it continues to captivate scholars and admirers of Renaissance art for its balance between spirituality and technical refinement. Number 47. Saint Sebastian, circa 1474. Sandro Botticelli, even at the beginning of his career, approached the iconography of Saint Sebastian with a sensitivity that goes beyond the mere representation of martyrdom. Painted in the context of Florentine devotion to this saint who protects against the plague, the work captures the moment after the torment, when the young Sebastian, standing and with his body pierced by arrows, becomes an emblem of resistance and grace. This version is distinguished by the stylized treatment of the anatomy, in which the artist combines the influence of Palaiuolo with the melancholic sweetness that defines his later work. Executed in tempera on wood, the piece exhibits a soft and ethereal modeling, where the saint's skin contrasts with the architectural coldness of the background, dominated by a serene Renaissance perspective. The figure is outlined against a landscape where the diffuse light gives an almost supernatural quality to the scene. More than a mere martyr, Sebastian embodies an idealized beauty, whose graceful posture hints at the influence of classical art. Today, the painting is in the Staatliche Museen in Berlin, where it remains a reference for the study of Botticelli's stylistic evolution. His imprint can be seen in later works such as Perugino's Saint Sebastian and, later, in the compositions of Pontormo, where the restrained expressiveness of the figures evokes the same introspective melancholy. Number 46. Portrait of a Man with a Medallion by Cosimo the Elder. Circa 1475. This portrait is one of Botticelli's most intriguing works, not only for the precision of its execution, but for the symbolic charge it contains. It was made at a time when Florentine painting was reaching a new sophistication in the art of portraiture, influenced by humanism and the revival of classical ideals. The work depicts a young man proudly holding a medallion bearing the effigy of Cosimo de' Medici, the illustrious patriarch of the dynasty that ruled Florence. It is not only a testimony of devotion to the Medici family, but an affirmation of the city's political and cultural heritage. His serene pose, combined with the psychological depth of his gaze, makes this portrait a piece of exceptional refinement. Painted in tempera on wood, the portrait shows Botticelli's mastery in capturing the individuality of the sitter through a subtle modulation of light and color. The meticulous texture of the clothing, the delicacy of the facial features, and the careful arrangement of the medallion make the image a visual document of great historical value. Beyond its commemorative intention, the portrait suggests a reflection on identity and power, fundamental concepts in 15th century Florence. It is currently in the Uffizi Gallery, where it dialogues with other great works of Renaissance portraiture. Its influence is notable in later portraits, especially in the work of artists such as Bronzino, who took elegance and symbolism to an even higher level in court painting. Number 45. The Virgin and Child with Saint John and an Angel. Circa 1488. In this exquisite composition, Botticelli offers an ethereal vision of divine motherhood, where the Virgin and Child appear surrounded by an aura of delicacy and melancholy. Created in a period in which the artist had already fully developed his style, the work shows his particular way of fusing devotion with an almost dreamlike idealization. Saint John the Baptist, in his childlike version, and a sweet-looking angel accompany the scene, establishing an emotional connection with the viewer. The arrangement of the figures within the space reflects a perfect geometric balance, where each element contributes to the harmony of the whole. The tempera on panel technique allows Botticelli to achieve a softness in the contours that accentuates the spirituality of the image. The color palette, dominated by soft and golden tones, gives the scene an atmosphere of serenity and contemplation. But beyond its formal beauty, the work is also a meditation on the prefiguration of Christ's destiny. The Virgin's expression, serene but introspective, suggests awareness of the future passion. Today, this piece is in the National Gallery in London, where it is one of the jewels of the Renaissance collection. Its influence is evident in the religious painting of later centuries, particularly in the work of Raphael, who reinterpreted this type of composition with a similar grace, but with a greater emphasis on naturalism. Number 44. The Virgin and Child with St. John in a Landscape. Circa 1500. Painted at the end of the 15th century, this work encapsulates Botticelli's stylistic evolution in his later years, when spirituality and mysticism became more prominent in his artistic production. The scene evokes the classical iconography of the Madonna and Child, but introduces a new sense of intimacy and tenderness in the relationship between the characters. The little St. John, in his devotional attitude, stands as a symbol of innocence and future redemption, while the evanescent landscape, treated with soft tones, suggests divine transcendence. Botticelli, marked in this period by the influence of the friar Savonarola and his ascetic vision, achieves with this work a synthesis between religious solemnity and the humanized delicacy of his figures. The tempera on panel, his favorite technique, here achieves a refined precision in the modeling of the faces and in the vaporousness of the hair, which seems to float in an ethereal atmosphere. The composition maintains Renaissance harmony with a triangular structure that provides the scene with balance and visual stability. Today, the work is kept in the National Gallery in London, where it is admired for its masterful use of color and the subtlety of its light transitions. Its influence can be seen in later generations, especially in the sacred painting of the 16th century, where its delicate play of expression and the plastic purity of the figures were replicated. Number 43. Scenes from the Life of Saint Zenobius. Circa 1500 and 1505. This series of paintings, executed in the last phase of Botticelli's career, depicts the life of Saint Zenobius, Bishop of Florence and one of the city's most revered figures. Through a sequence of episodes, the work conveys divine power and miracles in everyday life, a distinctive feature of Renaissance Christian iconography. The compositions are characterized by their narrative drama, where the characters' gestures and use of space lead the viewer's gaze to the culminating moments of each scene. This pictorial cycle can be interpreted as an echo of the religious fervor that dominated Botticelli's thinking in his later years, when his painting acquired an expressive intensity that transcends the idealized serenity of his early works. Executed in tempera on panel, the series stands out for its richness of color and the meticulousness in the representation of architectural details, a reflection of Renaissance Florence. The master's characteristic linearity is still present, although at this stage it becomes more angular and energetic, accentuating the drama of the story. Today, the panels are kept at the Louvre Museum in Paris, where they are considered one of Botticelli's most significant contributions to narrative art. His imprint can be perceived in the Mannerist painting of the 16th century, where the exacerbated gesturality and the expressive use of perspective find precedence in this work. Number 42. Portrait of Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici. Circa 1490 and 1495. Commissioned by the influential Medici family, This portrait reflects the status and personality of Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco, a distant cousin of Lorenzo the Magnificent and one of Botticelli's main patrons. Represented with an expression of calm authority, his gaze denotes the confidence of a man immersed in the complex political and cultural fabric of Florence. The artist subtly captures the individuality of his model, at a time when portraiture was becoming established as an independent genre within Renaissance art. Beyond physical fidelity, Botticelli manages to imbue the work with a psychological dimension, exploring the introspection and gravitas of the Florentine elite. Executed in tempera on wood, the portrait is distinguished by the precision of its drawing and the delicacy of the nuances in the complexion of the face, where the shadows are applied with almost imperceptible softness. The neutral background, a deliberate choice, highlights the figure and underlines its presence. Today, the work is part of the collection of the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, where it is part of the splendor of Renaissance portraiture. Its influence can be perceived in later portrait painters, such as Bronzino in the 16th century, who adopted its refined idealization and the hieratic dignity of its figures. Number 41. The Madonna and Child with 4 Angels and 6 Saints, Paula di San Barnaba. Circa 1488. Commissioned for the Church of San Barnaba in Florence, this majestic altarpiece is one of the most sublime examples of Marian devotion in Renaissance painting. The composition responds to the sacred structure of the Sacra Conversazione, in which the Virgin and Child appear in a solemn architectural setting, surrounded by saints and angels in a symmetrical arrangement. Botticelli, in his artistic maturity, achieves an atmosphere of serenity and spiritual elevation, where the golden light that envelops the figures is not only an aesthetic resource, but a visual manifestation of the divine. The work, in addition to its liturgical purpose, reflects the deep connection between art and faith in 15th century Florence, when religious commissions were not only an expression of devotion, but also of power and prestige. Technically, the piece reveals Botticelli's mastery of tempera on panel, with meticulous application of gold in the details that enhances the richness of the ornamentation and embroidery on the robes. The delicately modeled figures possess an ethereal grace that contrasts with the monumentality of the background architecture, evoking the influence of Filippo Lippi on the master's training. Symbolically, the enthroned child prefigures his messianic destiny, while the saints depicted, including Saint John the Baptist and Saint Michael the Archangel, suggest a visual dialogue between salvation and the fight against evil. Today, the work is housed in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, where it continues to captivate with its solemnity and refinement. Its echo can be heard in later artists such as Fra Bartolomeo and Perugino, who reinterpreted the model of the Sacra Conversazione with a similar sensibility. Number 40. The Virgin and Child by Botticelli. Circa 1470. Painted early in Botticelli's career, this delicate depiction of the Madonna and Child reflects the early influence of his teacher, Filippo Lippi, while foreshadowing the personal imprint the artist would develop in his Marian works. The image responds to the private devotion of the time, when Florentine homes often had paintings of the Madonna intended for prayer and contemplation. Mary's face, of unmistakable sweetness, embodies the ideal of ethereal beauty that Botticelli would perfect in later decades. The intimate and harmonious composition suggests a maternal relationship of infinite tenderness, in which the child, held delicately, seems to trust completely in his mother's arms. Executed in tempera on panel, the painting is distinguished by the softness of its tonal transitions and the exquisiteness of the details in the hair and fabrics. The subtle chiaroscuro gives volume to the figures without losing the delicacy characteristic of the artist's style. Beyond its technical value, The work contains a strong symbolic charge. The lily that the Virgin carries alludes to her purity, while the position of the child anticipates the future sacrifice. It is kept in the National Gallery in London, where its atmosphere of serenity continues to move viewers. Its influence is perceived in the evolution of the representation of motherhood in Renaissance art, serving as a model for numerous artists of the 15th century, including Leonardo da Vinci in his first Marian compositions. Number 39. The Madonna and Child enthroned with Saints Mary Magdalene, John the Baptist, Francis of Assisi, Catherine of Alexandria, Cosmas and Damian, circa 1470. At the dawn of the Florentine Renaissance, Sandro Botticelli conceived this monumental panel with the intention of capturing spiritual transcendence in an age of profound theological concerns. The work was commissioned for one of the chapels of the influential Medici family, whose patronage consolidated the artistic flourishing of the age. In this altarpiece, the Madonna and Child occupy the center of a sacred space, surrounded by saints who symbolize the union between mystical devotion and the earthly influence of the Church. Through this composition, Botticelli inscribes the image in the tradition of the Quattrocento, but with a gestural dynamism that foreshadows his more mature style. Botticelli's technical refinement is evident in his careful use of tempera on wood, which gives a unique luminosity to the draperies and golden halos. The pyramidal arrangement of the figures, characteristic of the Renaissance, reinforces visual stability, while the meticulous application of gold in the details highlights the sacredness of the whole. Each saint embodies a Christian ideal. Mary Magdalene symbolizes redemption, John the Baptist prophecy, and the brothers Cosimo and Damian, protectors of the Medici, the fusion of faith and power. The work is currently housed in the Uffizi Gallery, where it continues to fascinate with its balanced compositional harmony. Its influence is evident in the evolution of sacred art, inspiring later masters such as Perugino and Raphael, who adopted Botticelli's serene solemnity and linear precision in their own creations. Number 38. Saint Francis of Assisi with Angels. Around 1475 and 1480. In this work, Botticelli captures the mystical spirituality of Saint Francis of Assisi in a moment of heavenly communion. Painted in the last quarter of the 15th century, the scene is set in a sacred space where the saint, immersed in an almost ecstatic devotion, is surrounded by angels with graceful gestures and serene countenances. The composition reflects the influence of Franciscan thought in Florence at the time, highlighting the simplicity and humility of the saint, in contrast to the chromatic richness and detail typical of the Quattrocento style. The work is a testament to Botticelli's technical mastery in the use of tempera on panel, with a meticulous application of gold in the details of the angelic vestments. The fluidity of the stroke and the subtle blurring of the contours evoke an ethereal feeling, emphasizing the relationship between the divine and the human. Today, it is in a private collection, which limits its access to the public, but its impact on religious art is undeniable. The influence of this piece can be traced in later mystical representations, particularly in the Mannerists, who would adopt the spiritual expressiveness that Botticelli captured with singular mastery. Number 37. The Mystical Crucifixion. Circa 1500. This profoundly visionary work reflects the spiritual and political crisis that was ravaging Florence at the end of the 15th century, following the fall of the Medici and the rise of religious fervor instigated by Savonarola. Botticelli, influenced by this turbulent context, represents a scene of intense symbolic charge where the crucifixion of Christ is surrounded by angelic and human figures in a dramatic choreography of pain and redemption. The composition, with its marked verticality, generates a sensation of ascension and divine judgment, suggesting a cosmic order in the midst of earthly chaos. Executed in tempera on panel, the work is distinguished by the delicacy of the faces and the stylization of the figures, characteristics of the Florentine master. The chromatic range, dominated by golden and reddish tones, reinforces the mystical atmosphere of the scene. It is currently in the National Gallery in London, where it is considered one of the artist's most intriguing pieces. Its imprint can be observed in later devotional painting, particularly in the work of El Greco, who would take visionary spirituality to new levels of expressive intensity. Number 36. The Madonna del Padiglione, Madonna del Padiglione, circa 1493. This refined representation of the Madonna and Child is a supreme example of the delicacy with which Botticelli approached the Marian theme. The composition is framed in an elegant pavilion with rich draperies, symbolizing the sacred space of the Virgin as a heavenly throne. The gentleness of the gestures and the subtle inclination of the figures reflect the influence of the Byzantine iconographic tradition, reinterpreted with the grace and dynamism of the Florentine Quattrocento. The work, executed in tempera on wood, stands out for its meticulous glaze technique that gives the faces an almost unreal luminosity. The attention to detail in the folds of the clothing and the softness of the modeling are evidence of Botticelli's artistic maturity at this stage of his career. Today, the piece is kept in the Ambrosiana Library in Milan, where it stands as one of the most precious jewels of its collection. Its influence continued in the devotional painting of the 16th century, where the idealized conception of the Virgin was consolidated as a visual paradigm that survived in the Renaissance and Baroque tradition. Number 35. The Madonna del Mare, from 1469 to 1470. Early in his career, Sandro Botticelli began to define an artistic identity in which the delicacy of the female figure and spiritual depth were inseparable. The Madonna del Mare is an early testimony to this process, in which the serene and melancholic Madonna tenderly holds the infant Jesus while the seabed dissolves into an ethereal atmosphere. The work responds to the Marian devotion characteristic of the Florentine Renaissance, while also hinting at the artist's predilection for a subtle lyricism that would eventually become his hallmark. Executed in tempera on panel, the painting is meticulously crafted, with barely hinted gilding and soft color transitions reflecting the influence of his teacher, Fra Filippo Lippi. Botticelli makes the texture of the cloaks flow with an almost tactile naturalness, while the faces seem illuminated from within, achieving an effect of almost mystical spirituality. The Marian iconography, reinforced by the subtle reflection of the water in the background, suggests the duality between divine motherhood and protection over sailors, a theme especially appreciated in Florence, a merchant city. Today, the work is housed in the National Gallery in London, where its meticulous detail continues to influence generations of artists and scholars seeking to understand the first flashes of Botticelli's genius. Number 34. The Virgin Adoring the Child with Five Angels, circa 1485 and 1490. A mature work, the Madonna Adoring the Child with Five Angels embodies the refinement achieved by Botticelli in the last phase of his production. In this painting, the traditional scene of the Madonna and Child takes on an enveloping solemnity thanks to the presence of five angels who, in a counterpoint of postures and gestures, intensify the sacredness of the moment. The closed composition and the arrangement of the characters reveal a meticulous study of symmetry and visual rhythm, which gives the scene a serene balance. This work is set in a period when Botticelli was beginning to move away from idealization towards a more introspective and expressive vision. The tempera on wood used in this piece allows for an exquisite chromatic richness, where the superimposition of glazes gives the folds of the cloaks an almost sculptural volume. The angels, with their delicate hair and solemn gestures, evoke a visual musicality that resonates with the Neoplatonic ideas of the time. In the symbolic background, adoration becomes a meditation on the very nature of divinity, reflecting the philosophical tensions of the late Renaissance. Currently housed in the Poldi Pizzoli Museum in Milan, the work has had a notable influence on the representation of angels in later religious painting, consolidating Botticelli's image as a master of the sacred and the dreamlike. Number 33. The Return of Judith to Bethulia, around the years 1472 and 1473. Within Botticelli's pictorial corpus, The Return of Judith to Bethulia stands out as a work of vibrant narrative, where the biblical heroine, after having beheaded Holofernes, walks resolutely towards the salvation of her people. The lightness with which she holds the sword and her head wrapped in a cloth reinforce the contradiction between her apparent fragility and the fierce determination of her action. Botticelli here addresses an unusual theme in his repertoire, but he does so with the same grace and refinement that characterize his most lyrical compositions, achieving a fascinating tension between violence and elegance. The tempera on panel technique allows for a meticulous treatment of fabrics and hair, creating a sense of fluid movement that gives the figure of Judith an almost stage-like presence. The golden tones and subtle contrasts of light emphasize her prominence, while the background architecture frames the narrative with a persuasive sense of depth. This work, currently housed in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, anticipates the dynamism that Botticelli would deploy in later mythological compositions and has been a key reference in the representation of biblical heroines within Western art. Number 32. Portrait of Dante Alighieri, circa 1495. This portrait of Dante Alighieri is a testament to the Renaissance fascination with the great intellectuals of the past. Probably commissioned by a Florentine patron, the work responds to the renewed interest in the Divine Comedy in late 15th century Florence, when the rediscovery of classical texts was influencing the cultural identity of the city. Botticelli, who had already illustrated episodes from the literary work, captures in this portrait the idealized image of the exiled poet, showing Dante not only as the author of an immortal literary legacy, but also as a figure of moral and philosophical authority. Executed in tempera on panel, the portrait is notable for its sharp contours and the meticulousness of its features, emphasized by the characteristic red hood and laurel wreath, symbols of his role as poet laureate. Botticelli's technique of precise brushstrokes and subtle colors gives the figure an almost sculptural solemnity, enhanced by a neutral background that draws attention to his face and thoughtful expression. The work is currently housed in the Galleria degli Uffizi in Florence, where it is admired as an emblem of Renaissance humanism. Its influence has extended to later depictions of Dante, consolidating this image as the most recognizable of the poet and serving as a reference for artists of the following centuries, from the pre-Raphaelites to the symbolists of the 19th century. Number 31. Saint Jerome in Penitence, from the year 1498 to the year 1505. The theme of Saint Jerome the Penitent was a recurring theme in Renaissance painting, but in Botticelli's hands it took on a unique emotional intensity, reflecting the spiritual crisis he went through in his later years. The work was conceived during a period of profound change in Florentine society, marked by the influence of the friar Savonarola, whose apocalyptic sermons had a deep impact on the painter. This piece is a testament to the introspective turn of his art, where the exuberance of his mythological compositions gives way to a more austere and dramatic expression. Saint Jerome, isolated in the desert, flagellates himself with a stone in an act of extreme penitence, emphasizing the search for redemption through suffering. The work was executed using tempera and oil on wood, a combination that allows for a remarkable chromatic richness, especially in the representation of the saint's tanned skin and the earthy tones of the arid landscape that surrounds him. Botticelli uses a vertical composition that reinforces the feeling of isolation, with a rocky background that closes off the space and creates an atmosphere of desolation. Exhibited at the Berlin Art Museum, this piece has inspired numerous later artists, influencing the representation of Christian asceticism in the Baroque and the Expressionist vision of human suffering in later centuries. Number 30. Portrait of a young woman, Simonetta Vespucci. Circa 1480 and 1486. This portrait embodies the idealization of feminine beauty in the Florentine Quattrocento, while reflecting Botticelli's deep admiration for Simonetta Vespucci, considered the painter's muse par excellence. Simonetta, celebrated for her beauty at the Medici court, died prematurely, which fueled her transformation into an icon of ephemeral youth and grace. Although there is no absolute certainty about her identity in this painting, the delicacy of her features and the melancholy in her expression evoke the image of an idealized beauty that transcends the earthly. Executed in tempera on panel, the portrait is notable for the softness of its contours and the meticulous attention to detail of the hair, arranged in elaborate golden curls that flow harmoniously. The sfumato technique, applied with subtlety, gives the face an ethereal appearance, reinforced by the light that delicately shapes her features. Today, the work is in the Stadel Museum in Frankfurt, where it stands as one of the most iconic images of the Renaissance feminine ideal. Its influence has been notable in the evolution of the female portrait, leaving its mark on later artists such as Ingres and the Pre-Raphaelites, who took up its stylistic delicacy in search of a timeless beauty. Number 29. Portrait of Giuliano de' Medici. Circa 1478. The portrait of Giuliano de' Medici is a work of remarkable psychological depth that captures the image of one of the most influential figures of the Florentine Renaissance. Painted in a turbulent period, the portrait is set shortly before Giuliano's tragic murder in the Pazzi conspiracy, giving it a premonitory air. Botticelli, closely linked to the Medici family, not only immortalizes the nobility of his model, but also translates onto canvas the melancholy and introspection of a man destined for greatness, but caught up in the intrigues of his time. Technically, the work stands out for the delicacy in the treatment of the face and the precision in the texture of the fabrics, elements that Botticelli masters with mastery. The use of tempera on board allows for an enveloping luminosity, while the sober chromatic range reinforces the solemnity of the character. Its symbolism transcends the conventional portrait. Giuliano's serious expression and the subtle inclination of his head evoke a noble resignation, a visual echo of human fragility in the face of fate. Today, the work is in the National Gallery in Washington, where it remains a reference for studies of Renaissance portraiture. Its influence is palpable in later generations, from the portraits of Bronzino to the subtle psychological introspection of the Baroque masters. Number 28. The Trials of Moses, fresco in the Sistine Chapel. From 1481 to 1482. In the context of the ambitious project for the decoration of the Sistine Chapel, Botticelli created the Trials of Moses, a work that stands out for its narrative complexity and compositional mastery. Commissioned by Pope Sixtus IV as part of the cycle on the life of Moses and Christ, the fresco illustrates key episodes of the Hebrew prophet, from his exile to the revelation of his mission. The richness of the scene and the multiplicity of figures reveal Botticelli's ability to articulate scenes of intense dramatic charge, in a perfect synthesis between the divine and the earthly. The fresco technique, with its demand for rapid execution on wet plaster, allowed Botticelli to display vibrant chromaticism and a sure brushstroke. The distribution of the groups and the use of architectural perspective create a dynamic of tension and solemnity. Symbols are abundant. Moses' staff, his gestures of leadership, and the presence of secondary characters who guide the viewer's gaze reinforce the idea of divine destiny. As part of the fresco ensemble of the Sistine Chapel, this work is on display in the Vatican, where its splendor continues to captivate scholars and visitors. Its imprint is evident in the Mannerist tradition and in the visual narrative of artists such as Raphael and Michelangelo. Number 27. The Story of Lucretia. From the year 1496 to the year 1504. Drama and moral virtue are the central themes of the story of Lucretia, one of Botticelli's most striking compositions in his mature period. Based on the classic story by Titus Livius, the painting deals with the tragic story of Lucretia, whose death caused the fall of the monarchy in Rome. The work is a reflection of the political concerns of Florence at the end of the 15th century, when republican ideas were gaining strength in the face of the crumbling power of the Medici. Botticelli, influenced by the reformist spirit of Savonarola, endows the scene with an unusual moral gravity, turning it into a plea against corruption and injustice. The elongated format and sequential arrangement of the scenes demonstrate an absolute mastery of pictorial space. The master's characteristic tempera on wood technique allows for a palette rich in contrasts, with golden and reddish tones that emphasize the emotional intensity of the story. The symbolism is overwhelming. The sword, Lucretia's lifeless body, and the expressions of the characters function as a visual narration of sacrifice and virtue. The work is currently in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Gallery in Boston, where it continues to be the object of admiration and analysis. Its impact is visible in later historical painting, from Mannerist frescoes to the neoclassical representations of David and Ingres. Number 26. The Madonna of the Lodge, Madonna della Loggia. Circa 1467. With a delicacy that foreshadows his pictorial genius, Sandro Botticelli immortalizes in the Madonna of the Loggia a moment of devotion and sweetness. The work, created in the early years of his career, reflects the influence of the Florentine Quattrocento and the legacy of his teacher Filippo Lippi. The Madonna holds the child in a gesture of restrained tenderness, while an architectural background alludes to the structure of a loggia, creating a subtle play between the sacred and the mundane. This composition, far from grandiloquence, finds its strength in the intimacy of the maternal bond, anticipating the characteristic sensitivity of the master. The technical execution of the work displays the meticulousness of tempera on wood, with a palette dominated by soft tones and lighting that models the faces with great delicacy. The loggia frames the scene, giving it depth, while the play of light reinforces the spirituality of the image. Marian symbolism is present in the colors and in the closed composition, which evokes the recollection of faith. Currently housed in the Uffizi Gallery, the work not only bears witness to Botticelli's stylistic evolution, but also inspired later representations of the Virgin, influencing his famous Madonna del Magnificat and Raphael's Renaissance Madonnas. Number 25. The Virgin Adoring the Sleeping Child. Circa 1490. At the height of his artistic maturity, Botticelli conceived the Virgin Adoring the Sleeping Child, a work in which melancholy and devotion intertwine in a scene of unusual serenity. Unlike conventional representations of the waking child, here he appears asleep in a gesture premonitory of his passion, while the Virgin contemplates him with an expression of resigned love. This piece, which is inserted in the context of the rise of private devotion in 15th century Florence, shows the introspective sensitivity of the artist in his later period, marked by an increasingly deep spirituality. The work, executed in tempera on panel, stands out for its exquisite precision in detail, from the delicate modeling of the faces to the fluidity of the folds in the cloaks. The soft, diffused light envelops the scene in an atmosphere of contemplation, reinforced by the austerity of the background. Symbolically, the arrangement of the figures evokes the gesture of adoration of the Pietas, establishing an iconographic link between the Nativity and the Crucifixion. Currently in the National Gallery in London, this painting not only had an impact on the religious imagery of the Renaissance, but also influenced the representation of the sleeping child by artists such as Perugino and Fra Bartolomeo. Number 24. The Last Communion of Saint Jerome, circa 1495. In one of his most dramatic compositions, Botticelli presents the Last Communion of Saint Jerome, a work of profound emotional charge and mysticism. The scene captures the moment when the elderly Jerome, exhausted by penitence and devotion, receives the Eucharist on his deathbed. At a time when spiritual crisis was shaking Florence, Botticelli moved away from the idealized beauty of his Madonnas and embraced a more severe aesthetic, with elongated figures and gestures of intense pathos. The influence of Savonarola and his preaching on the purification of sacred art is undeniable, reflecting a transformation in the painter's vision. The work, executed in tempera on wood, displays an austere treatment of color, with a predominance of earthy tones and lighting that dramatizes the scene. The pyramidal arrangement of the figures reinforces the tension, while the expression of Saint Jerome transmits the intensity of his faith. The symbolism is manifested in the presence of the monks who assist him, representing the continuity of the church. Housed in the Berlin Art Museum, this piece left a mark on later religious iconography, serving as a reference for works by Domenico Ghirlandaio and Michelangelo, who took up the solemnity and pathos of the saint's final moment. Number 23. The Vision of Saint Augustine, circa 1488. Sandro Botticelli, in his mature artistic period, captured in the Vision of Saint Augustine the tension between the earthly and the divine, a recurring theme in medieval theology. Inspired by the writings of the saint, the Florentine master illustrates the moment when Saint Augustine, in his study, is overcome by a heavenly revelation. The work, conceived at the time when Botticelli was approaching the Neoplatonic circles of Florence, reflects the Renaissance concern for introspection and transcendental knowledge. Its balanced composition and almost mystical atmosphere reveal a profound meditation on spirituality and the search for truth. The work is distinguished by the delicacy of its execution, characteristic of Botticelli's technical mastery. Worked on egg tempera on board, the painting exhibits subtle modeling in the faces and a fluidity in the draping of the clothing that accentuate the sense of contained movement. The minute details of the furniture and books in the saint's study suggest not only the refinement of linear perspective, but also a meticulous visual narrative. Today, the Vision of Saint Augustine is in the Galleria degli Uffizi in Florence, where it continues to be admired for its symbolic depth. The influence of this work can be seen in later artists who explored the representation of the divine in everyday life, consolidating a pictorial language that amalgamates the real with the ethereal. Number 22. The Discovery of the Corpse of Holofernes, circa 1470. Within the corpus of Botticelli's early works, the discovery of the corpse of Holofernes stands as a testament to the narrative drama that the Florentine master would perfect throughout his career. Inspired by the biblical story of Judith and Holofernes, The painting captures the moment when Assyrian soldiers find the decapitated body of their general, victim of the bravery of a woman who symbolizes divine justice. Botticelli, still under the influence of his teacher Filippo Lippi, composes a scene of unusual theatricality, marked by an emotional intensity that anticipates the expressiveness of his later works. The work, executed in tempera on panel, displays a compositional rigor that balances the drama of the scene with a studied visual harmony. The color palette, dominated by earthy and golden tones, reinforces the sense of contained tension, while the detailed treatment of the drapery and armor denotes a meticulous observation of materials. Today, this piece is preserved in the Louvre Museum, where it resonates as one of the first manifestations of Botticelli's ability to capture emotional intensity in narrative painting. Its impact can be traced to the production of Mannerist artists who, a century later, accentuated the gesturality and theatricality in their compositions inspired by biblical stories. Number 21. The Virgin and Child with Two Angels. From 1468 to 1469, the Madonna and Child with Two Angels represents one of Botticelli's first achievements in exploring the Marian theme, inscribing itself within the devotional tradition of 15th-century Florence. In this composition, the painter abandons the hieratic solemnity of his predecessors to endow the scene with an unusual lyrical grace. The Madonna, with a serene and contemplative expression, holds the child while two angels, with ethereal and youthful faces, elevate the image to an almost celestial dimension. The softness of their gestures and the sweetness of their gazes evoke a tangible humanity that foreshadows the emotional refinement characteristic of Botticelli's mature work. The piece, executed in tempera on wood, stands out for the delicacy of the modeling of the faces and the exquisite transparency of the veils that cover the Virgin, evidencing the influence of Filippo Lippi on the young Botticelli. The precision of the contours and the fluidity of the hair reveal the distinctive style that would define his later production. Today, the work is in the National Gallery in London, where it is considered a milestone in the evolution of Marian iconography in the Renaissance. Its influence extends to numerous painters of the Quattrocento, who, inspired by the tenderness of the scene, sought to integrate greater naturalness into their religious representations, marking a turning point in the pictorial tradition of the period. Number 20. The Lamentation over the Dead Christ. Circa 1490. With a drama that anticipates the tensions of Mannerist art, The Lamentation over the Dead Christ is one of Botticelli's most moving compositions. Painted during a period of intense transformation both in Florence and in his own life, the work reflects a profound spiritual introspection. Botticelli, influenced by the apocalyptic thinking of Savonarola, abandons the classical serenity of his early period to delve into a heartbreaking expressiveness. The gestures of the characters, charged with exacerbated pain, evoke the theater of Christian devotion of the 15th century, intensifying the feeling of loss and despair. Botticelli's technique in this piece reveals a remarkable mastery in the treatment of volumes and textures. The composition is structured with a masterful use of line and subdued chromaticism, where earthy tones and golden reflections give the scene an atmosphere of contemplation. The central theme, the death of Christ, is framed in an iconography that evokes passion and sacrifice, with a symbolism that reinforces the idea of redemption through suffering. Today, this work is in the Poldi Pizzoli Museum in Milan, where it is valued not only for its emotional spiritual charge, but also for the influence it exerted on later artists, especially the Mannerists, who reinterpreted its drama in a more exaggerated and ornamental key. Number 19. Madonna del Rosetto. Circa 1470. In the ethereal sweetness of Madonna del Rosetto, Botticelli captures the essence of sacred motherhood with a delicacy evoking late Gothic painting traditions, but with the freshness and refinement of the Florentine Quattrocento. Executed in his youth, the work already displays the distinctive features of his style: softness of contours, stylized figures, and a lyricism that transforms the image into an almost heavenly vision. The figure of the Madonna, surrounded by a lush rosebush, symbolizes purity and divine grace, while the arrangement of the folds in her garment hints at the meticulousness with which Botticelli observed reality, without renouncing its idealized character. Painted in tempera on wood, the work is distinguished by its meticulous attention to detail in the representation of the petals and leaves, whose textures vibrate with an almost mystical luminosity. The triangular composition, clearly influenced by Leonardesque, balances the relationship between the Virgin and Child, establishing a visual communication charged with tenderness. This work is kept in the Berlin Art Museum, where it remains a point of reference for the study of the evolution of the Florentine master. Its influence extends to later generations of devotional artists, who found in his idealized representation of the Virgin a model of beauty and spirituality that is difficult to match. Number 18. The History of Virginia, from the year 1496 to the year 1504. Inspired by the tales of Titus Livius, the story of Virginia is one of Botticelli's last great narrative compositions, marked by a dramatic density and visual complexity that reflect the turbulent context of the late 15th century. The work illustrates the tragic fate of Virginia, a young Roman woman whose death at the hands of her own father was the symbol of the fight against tyranny. In this piece, Botticelli demonstrates his mastery of space and movement, organizing the action in a sequence of episodes that intertwine in a meticulously crafted urban landscape. The exalted gestures and expressiveness of the faces reinforce the theatrical character of the scene, evidencing the echo of humanist rhetoric in Renaissance painting. The tempera technique, combined with a palette of vibrant tones, highlights the tension of the narrative, where classical architecture and the vehement gestures of the characters combine to convey a sense of imminent tragedy. The work is in the Carrara Academy in Bergamo, where it continues to attract the attention of historians and artists fascinated by its compositional structure. Its influence is perceived in the later development of historical painting, influencing 16th-century artists who took up its capacity for narrative synthesis to capture stories with a strong moral and political charge. Number 17. The Temptations of Christ, fresco in the Sistine Chapel, from 1481 to 1482. Commissioned by Pope Sixtus IV for the decoration of the Sistine Chapel, The Temptations of Christ is one of Sandro Botticelli's most notable contributions to the grandiose visual narrative of sacred space. Executed at the height of the Renaissance, the work is part of the monumental cycle of frescoes illustrating episodes from the Old and New Testaments, in dialogue with the majesty of Vatican architecture. Botticelli, along with other great Florentine masters of the time, worked on this colossal undertaking, leaving his mark on a scene that illustrates with refined theatricality the spiritual challenges faced by Christ in the desert. Every gesture and every expression in the composition resonates with the drama of Renaissance sacred painting, elevating the message to a timeless dimension. Executed in fresco, the artist applied his mastery of drawing and anatomy with exceptional meticulousness, achieving soft volumes and highly plastic gestures. The technique of superimposing translucent layers allows the light to subtly shape the bodies, while the architectural composition frames the figures with a rigorous linear perspective. Symbolically, the scene confronts divinity with human fragility, establishing a play of tensions between temptation and virtue. Today, the work remains in its original location within the Sistine Chapel, sharing the spotlight with the creations of Michelangelo and other illustrious masters. Its influence resonates in multiple later representations of the theme, from Mannerist painting to Baroque interpretations that delve deeper into the dramatic expressiveness of the biblical story. Number 16. The Madonna of the Book, Madonna del Libro. Circa 1480 and 1481. A work of delicate visual poetry, the Madonna with a Book depicts with exquisite intimacy the relationship between the Virgin and Child, encapsulating the Florentine Renaissance ideal of serene and contemplative beauty. In this devotional portrait, Botticelli moves away from narrative grandiloquence to concentrate on the tenderness of the scene, where the open book symbolizes divine wisdom and the prophecy of Christ's destiny. The refinement with which the painter constructs the atmosphere suggests a serene spirituality, reflected in Mary's slow gestures and melancholic expression. The vibrant colors of the draperies, in particular the deep blue of her cloak, contrast with the delicacy of the translucent skin, revealing a technical virtuosity that elevates the work to an almost ethereal dimension. Botticelli displays his mastery in the technique of oil on panel, achieving an effect of softness and luminosity that gives the composition an almost unreal air. The fine glazes applied to the flesh tones and the subtle tonal gradation in the fabrics reveal a meticulousness that anticipates the plastic values of the High Renaissance. The Marian iconography, enriched by the presence of the book and the serene arrangement of the figures, influenced countless later representations of the theme, establishing a model that would be taken up by Raphael and other Renaissance masters. The work, preserved in the Ambrosiana Library in Milan, remains one of the most delicate interpretations of the maternal divine bond, inspiring generations of artists in the search for an idealized beauty. Number 15. Virgin with the Child Jesus and Saint John the Baptist. Circa 1490 and 1495. In Madonna with the Christ Child and Saint John the Baptist, Botticelli combines sacred solemnity with a deeply human gentleness, creating a balanced composition in which the characters emerge naturally within a serene setting. The scene establishes a symbolic link between the Madonna, the Child, and the young Saint John the Baptist, who, in his prefigurative role, anticipates the Passion of Christ. The melancholy implicit in the gestures and glances suggests a contemplation of the sacred that transcends merely figurative representation. Here, the Florentine master demonstrates his unique sensitivity for expression and movement, structuring the composition in a harmonious triangle that reinforces the stability and serenity of the whole. Technically, the work stands out for the delicacy of its lines, the softness of its contours, and the exquisite chromatic gradation that gives the figures an inner luminosity. The fluidity of the drawing and the transparency of the pictorial layers reveal the influence of the Florentine tradition, while the shading of the faces adds a nuance of emotional introspection. The symbolism of the child in dialogue with St. John refers to a theological reading of the messianic destiny, while the landscape in the background provides a lyrical depth characteristic of Botticelli's art. Currently housed in the Louvre Museum, the work has had a notable influence on the evolution of religious painting, serving as a reference for the representation of sacred childhood in later iconography. Number 14. Saint Augustine in his study. 1480. Commissioned as part of the ornamentation of the Church of Ognissanti in Florence, this work by Botticelli captures the figure of Saint Augustine in a moment of introspection and erudition. Framed within a sober cell but full of knowledge, the saint, in full maturity, seems interrupted in his writing by an intellectual revelation. Botticelli, always attentive to the dynamism of human psychology, here represents the tension between divine thought and earthly reality, endowing the character with an expression of deep concentration and determination. The masterfully applied fresco technique gives the scene a velvety texture, in which the precision of the strokes coexists with the warmth of the ochre and earthy hues. The careful modeling of the light accentuates the volume of the objects and the structure of the space, framing St. Augustine within an austere but intellectually rich atmosphere. The symbolism of the study, with scattered books and writing tools, reinforces the idea of the saint as a figure of thought and reason. Today, this fresco still occupies its original place in the Church of Ognissanti, integrating into the visual discourse of the chapel. The influence of this representation can be seen in later interpretations of scholarly saints, such as the versions of Saint Jerome made in the 16th and 17th centuries, which capture the same intellectual intensity in their expression. Number 13. The Stories of Nostagio degli Onesti. Circa 1483. Inspired by the 8th novel of the 5th day of Boccaccio's Decameron, this 4-panel series was commissioned on the occasion of a wedding, symbolizing the values of union and morality within Florentine society. Botticelli visually narrates the torment of the specter of a rejected knight and his perpetual hunt for the woman who scorned his love. The sequence of scenes, full of dynamism, captures both the supernatural horror and the transformation of the tale into a moral warning, recalling the power of social norms over individual will. The artist executes these scenes with remarkable meticulousness, using the technique of tempera on wood to achieve a luminous palette of great chromatic richness. The arrangement of the characters and the spatial depth are articulated with an almost scenographic precision, generating a sense of narrative rhythm that guides the viewer's gaze through each episode. Nature, omnipresent, becomes a witness to the human drama, reflecting the balance between the real and the fantastic. Currently, the series is divided between the Prado Museum in Madrid and private collections, which has fragmented its original reading. Nevertheless, its influence is undeniable, since the narrative structure of the work influenced Venetian painting at the end of the 15th century, emphasizing the capacity of the image to tell stories with an almost theatrical clarity. Number 12. Portrait of a Young Man with a Medal. Circa 1474 and 1475. This portrait of a young man stands out as one of Botticelli's most refined works in the portrait genre, standing out both for its bold frontality and its psychological subtlety. It depicts a young nobleman, whose identity has been the subject of debate, proudly holding a medal of Cosimo de' Medici, an unequivocal symbol of the family's political and cultural influence in 15th century Florence. Beyond the individual representation, the work embodies the sophistication and humanistic ideal of the period, where the personal image acquired a significant weight in the construction of memory and identity. Executed in tempera on panel, the portrait displays Botticelli's meticulousness in the execution of facial features, highlighting in particular the smoothness of the skin and the softness of the hair, treated with an almost sculptural delicacy. The chromatic depth and balanced composition reveal a clear search for visual harmony, while the sober background directs all attention to the subject. Today, the work is part of the collection of the Uffizi Museum in Florence, where it has established itself as an emblem of Quattrocento portraiture. Its influence spread into later artistic circles, serving as a model for Renaissance portraits that, from the 16th century onwards, sought to capture not only the appearance, but also the intellectual and moral essence of their models. Number 11. The Pietà, circa 1490. In the last quarter of the 15th century, Botticelli conceived the Pietà at a time of profound spiritual and artistic transformation in Florence. Framed within the devotional tradition, the work reflects the anguish and pathos characteristic of Christian iconography of the time, but filtered through the master's melancholic sensibility. In it, the lament over the body of Christ departs from the monumental grandeur of other pietas, opting for an emotional intimacy that anticipates the expressiveness of the painter's later years, influenced by the religious fervor that dominated Florence in the years before his death. The technique is distinguished by the refinement of the tempera on panel, with a meticulous arrangement of the figures in a compressed space that intensifies the drama of the scene. The chromatic range, dominated by earthy and golden tones, emphasizes the solemnity of the moment, while the meticulous treatment of the cloths reinforces the structural tension. Beyond its religious charge, the work is a manifesto of the transition between Renaissance idealism and the spiritual restlessness that would mark the beginning of the 16th century. Today, the piece is kept in the Poldi Pizzoli Gallery in Milan, where its resonance moves both art historians and faithful devotees. Its particular emotional intensity left its mark on later devotional painting, influencing artists such as Perugino and, later, the sacred work of Pontormo. Number 10. Fortress. 1470. Painted early in Botticelli's career, Fortitude is part of a set of allegories commissioned for the Court of Merchandise in Florence, which extolled the cardinal virtues in the civic and political context of the city. This work, unique in its genre, exhibits a conception of strength that departs from traditional rigidity. The female figure, of sculptural elegance, does not impose her presence with aggression, but with a serene and majestic dignity. Her resolute but restrained attitude reflects a balance between strength and reason, a message of order and control in a Florence that was transitioning between artistic splendor and political tensions. Executed in tempera on panel, the work demonstrates the technical precision of the young Botticelli, who, influenced by the school of Filippo Lippi, achieved a soft modeling of the volumes and a clear definition of the drawing. The meticulously rendered armor and the flowing clothing establish a contrast between the hardness of the metal and the feminine grace, underlining the symbolic duality of the piece. Exhibited at the Uffizi Gallery, the work is part of the tradition of allegorical representations of the 15th century, influencing the development of the idealized portrait in the Renaissance. Its influence can be seen in later Venetian painting, in artists such as Giorgione, who reinterpreted the nobility and balance of the female figure in a humanist context. Number 9. The Mystical Nativity, Nativita Mystica, from the year 1500 to the year 1501. Considered one of Botticelli's most enigmatic works, the mystical Nativity moves away from the classical serenity of the Renaissance to an intense, apocalyptic vision of the birth of Christ. Conceived in a period of personal and political crisis, when Florence was shaken by the preaching of Savonarola and the fall of the Medici, the work encapsulates a sense of spiritual urgency. The densely populated scene features dancing angels and human figures in attitudes of adoration and supplication, while the Madonna and Child occupy the center with a disturbing serenity. The prophetic character of the composition, with inscriptions alluding to redemption and the Last Judgment, reinforces its uniqueness within the artist's corpus. Executed in oil on panel, a technique unusual in his production, the work stands out for the superposition of planes and the compositional dynamism, in an apparent disorder that suggests a transcendental vision rather than an earthly one. The golden tones and diffuse luminosity give the scene a supernatural quality, accentuating the feeling of revelation. Housed in the National Gallery in London, the mystical Nativity has been the subject of multiple interpretations and analyses that link it both to Flemish painting and to the symbolism of visionary art. Its bold break with Renaissance idealism anticipates mannerism and, centuries later, would influence expressionist aesthetics due to its emotional intensity and symbolic charge. Number 8. Venus and Mars, Venire e Marte. Circa 1485. Sandro Botticelli's Venus and Mars emerges from a period of Florentine splendor, when the exaltation of classical mythology found its echo in painting. Probably commissioned by the powerful Vespucci family, the scene represents the delicate balance between sensuality and intelligence, a visual dialogue between the goddess of love and the god of war. Venus, immaculate and serene, dominates with her gaze a Mars overcome by sleep, stripped of his armor and vulnerable to feminine grace. This subtle play of contrasts evokes the ideal harmony of love over brute force, a recurring theme in Renaissance iconography. Botticelli displays his technical mastery through a precise execution in tempera on panel, where the fineness of the contours and the softness of the flesh tones acquire an almost ethereal character. The symbolic richness is reinforced by the presence of the mischievous fauns who strip Mars of his weapons, mocking his defeat by the divinity of love. Exhibited at the National Gallery in London, the work has had a notable influence on the allegorical representation of courtly love, serving as inspiration for later generations who have reinterpreted the relationship between the divine and the earthly through painting. Number 7. Pallas and the Centaur, Pallade e il Centauro. From 1482 to 1483. Commissioned at the height of Lorenzo de' Medici's court, Pallas and the Centaur is part of the refined Florentine intellectual circle, where Neoplatonism dictated a profound dialogue between the mythological and the moral. The work, conceived in a period of transition for Botticelli, presents Pallas Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, firmly holding a centaur, a symbol of unbridled instincts and barbarism. Her gesture of dominance is both physical and conceptual. Civilizing intelligence subdues irrational violence, a message in keeping with the political and cultural sophistication of Renaissance Florence. The tempera on panel allows for a rich chromaticity of delicate nuances, especially in the golds and greens that cover the goddess. The ornamentation of her dress, with intertwined motifs of olive branches, reinforces the idea of the victory of reason over brutality. Currently in the Uffizi in Florence, the work has been a reference for multiple philosophical and artistic interpretations, influencing the iconography of feminine power in later centuries and the evolution of allegorical painting within the Renaissance tradition. Number 6. The Madonna of the Magnificat, Madonna del Magnificat. From the year 1481 to the year 1485. In the context of a Florence in which Marian devotion reached its highest expression, the Madonna del Magnificat stands as a paradigm of the fusion between spirituality and pictorial refinement. Botticelli represents the Virgin in a moment of contemplative grace, crowned by angels while she writes the words of the Magnificat, the song of praise taken from the Gospel of Luke. Her serene countenance and the circular arrangement of the composition accentuate the idea of a suspended time, where divine motherhood becomes an emblem of heavenly perfection. Executed in tempera on panel, the work stands out for its meticulous detail and the delicacy in the transition between gold and pearlescent tones, which give the scene an ethereal glow. The crown that the angels place on the Virgin underlines her role as Queen of Heaven, while the book she holds reinforces her role as a symbol of divine wisdom. Currently housed in the Uffizi in Florence, this work has been a recurring model in the Marian iconography of Western art, inspiring countless representations of the Virgin in later religious painting. Number 5. The Annunciation of Cestello, Annunciazione di Cestello. from the year 1489 to the year 1490. Conceived during a period of profound transformation in late 15th century Florence, this work embodies the mystical sensibility that dominated the city under the growing influence of Girolamo Savonarola. Commissioned for the convent of Santa Maria Maddalena de' Pazzi, then known as Cestello, the scene of the Annunciation takes on a solemnity that goes beyond the Gospel account. Botticelli, marked by the religious fervor that permeated Florentine society, depicts the interaction between the angel Gabriel and the Virgin with a restrained dynamism, as if the transcendence of the message were materialized in the dense air that surrounds them. Executed in tempera on panel, the work displays a technical mastery in the use of linear perspective, evident in the architectural arrangement that frames the scene. The composition is a balance between geometric rigor and the gestural lyricism that defines the master's late work. Beyond the biblical narrative, the painting is loaded with symbolism. The opening of the loggia to the landscape not only deepens the space, but suggests a transition between the divine and the earthly. Today, the work is kept in the Uffizi Gallery, where it stands as a testimony to Botticelli's aesthetic evolution and his ability to combine Renaissance elegance with spiritual intensity. His influence is felt in later generations, particularly in the Mannerists, who took up the restrained expressiveness of his figures and the theatricality of his compositions. Number 4. The Calumny of Apelles, La Calunnia, circa 1495. Inspired by a story by the Greek writer Lucian of Samosata, this work is a refined exercise in pictorial erudition and a veiled commentary on the political intrigues that shook Florence in the last years of the 15th century. Botticelli recovers the compositional structure described by Lucian, adapting it to his own visual language. The scene, charged with tension, presents Calumny dragging her victim before an unwary king, while the allegories of ignorance and suspicion influence him, an evident echo of the political instability that lived in Medici Florence. The painting, executed using the tempera on panel technique, is distinguished by the ornamental richness and the attention to detail of the figures, whose plastic refinement evokes ancient classicism. The architectural monumentality reinforces the sense of theatricality and frames the allegory with a compositional rigor that denotes the maturity of the artist. Beyond its technical virtuosity, the work contains a message of timeless relevance, the manipulation of truth and the corruption of human judgment. Today housed in the Uffizi Gallery, this piece has been a source of inspiration for later artists, from the Florentine Mannerists to the Baroque painters, fascinated by its contained drama and the psychological complexity of its characters. Number 3. The Adoration of the Magi, around the year 1475. In this monumental commission for the Lamy family, Botticelli transforms a traditional sacred theme into an exaltation of 15th century Florentine splendor. With a novel approach, the artist integrates members of the powerful Medici family into the scene, intermingling them with biblical characters in a gesture of devotion and affirmation of their social preeminence. The Adoration of the Magi thus becomes a synthesis of Renaissance humanism, where the divine and the earthly coexist in an exceptional pictorial harmony. Executed in tempera on panel, the work stands out for its vibrant chromatic richness and the exquisite treatment of the clothing and faces, each of them endowed with an individuality unusual for the time. The mastery of perspective is evident in the architectural composition, which guides the gaze towards the central figure of the Madonna and Child, surrounded by the retinue of worshippers in a circular arrangement that gives depth and dynamism to the scene. It is currently housed in the Uffizi Gallery, where it remains one of the master's most admired pieces. Its impact on Florentine painting was profound, establishing a model for later representations of the adoration that artists such as Leonardo da Vinci and Perugino took up and reinterpreted with their own stylistic nuances. Number 2. Spring. Around the year 1482. Conceived at the height of the Florentine Renaissance, Primavera is a pictorial celebration of mythology and Neoplatonic scholarship. Commissioned by Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, the work embodies the intellectual refinement of the Florentine court, where art, poetry, and philosophy converged into an ideal of unrivaled beauty. Botticelli, immersed in this circle of humanists, transcends mere figurative representation and creates an allegory of fertility and cosmic harmony, evoking the cadences of the poetry of Ovid and Lucretius in an ethereal and deeply symbolic composition. Executed in tempera on panel, the work is distinguished by the meticulous application of pigments and the delicacy of its glazes, elements that give the figures an almost supernatural glow. In this garden suspended in timelessness, Venus presides with her serene gesture, while around her a ballet of divinities and nymphs unfolds in a perfect choreographic order. The arrival of spring, represented in the metamorphosis of Chloris into Flora, becomes a visual ode to love and regeneration. Exhibited at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, the painting has exerted an inescapable influence on the symbolist aesthetic and on the pre-Raphaelite art of the 19th century, consolidating its status as one of the most sublime creations of the Quattrocento. Number 1. The Birth of Venus, La Nascita di Venere. Circa 1485. With incomparable grace, The Birth of Venus bursts into art history as an ethereal vision of idealized beauty. Commissioned by the powerful Medici family, the work is a visual manifesto of the Neoplatonic conception of love and perfection. Inspired by classical literature, in particular by the verses of Poliziano, the scene recreates the moment when Venus, born from the foam of the sea, reaches the shore, propelled by the zephyrs. The goddess, in her modest nudity, embodies the sublimation of desire, in a balance between the carnal and the divine that defined Renaissance sensibility. Botticelli chose an exceptional technique for its time: tempera on canvas, a support less common in the 15th century, which gives an unrivaled softness to the forms and accentuates the fluidity of the undulating lines. The atmosphere of the composition, with its diaphanous light and chromatic harmony, evokes a dreamlike world where reality dissolves into idealization. Currently housed in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, the work has left an indelible mark on the history of art, influencing movements as diverse as 18th century academicism and 20th century fashion illustration, where its iconography continues to be reinterpreted as an emblem of the feminine ideal. Thank you for watching our video. Subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. Give it a like, comment your thoughts, and share this video with your friends and family.